Now, as we've been reporting, President John F. Kennedy died 50 years ago today. What isn't as well known is that the British authors Aldous Huxley and C.S. Lewis also died on the 22nd of November 1963. They were established and influential writers at the time of their deaths, and their passing might have been much more newsworthy were it not for the Kennedy assassination. But neither found a place on the following day's front pages. While Aldous Huxley was more renowned at the time of his death, C.S. Lewis has since gained in popularity. He's best known, of course, for the Chronicles of Narnia series, which has sold 100 million copies worldwide and been adapted for screen and stage. Well, I'm joined here in the studio by Nicholas Murray, who has written a biography on Aldous Huxley, which is now considered to be the standard work on the life of Huxley, and also by Michael Ward, a leading expert on the works of C.S. Lewis. He joins us from our Oxford studio. Nicholas Murray. So, had Aldous Huxley not died on the same day as Kennedy, do you think we would have been more aware, in public at least, of his legacy?
I think by the time he died, his reputation was reasonably secure, so that I think that he would be unlikely to be permanently devalued by having been wiped off the headlines just on one day, and I think his reputation continued to flourish.
OK, and let me ask you the same question, Michael Ward. What do you think?
I think that Lewis himself expected his reputation to go into a nosedive after his death in any case. So being obscured or overshadowed by Kennedy's assassination would have, to him, made no difference. As it happens, he predicted completely wrongly, and his reputation has only risen since his death.
OK, let me just ask you, Nicholas Murray. I mean, did Aldous Huxley have anything to say about JFK when he was president?
I can only think of one fleeting reference where he, quite late in the day, he felt that he wanted to believe, I think, wanted to hope that perhaps Kennedy was the Great White Hope, but he was already fairly disillusioned about world politics by that stage, and I don't think he was expecting very much.
I mean, Aldous Huxley, Brave New World, of course, is a very famous book. It's a sort of standard textbook now, isn't it? I mean, it was seen, people didn't realise at the time, except with hindsight now, just how relevant and prescient it is. I mean, what is it, the babies being produced in test tubes, kind of like a production line.
Yes, I think it is extremely pertinent and remains so. It's interesting to contrast it with another very famous and powerful modern dystopia, George Orwell's 1984. And they had an exchange of correspondence in which Huxley said he enjoyed reading in 1984, but he felt that his book was better prophecy. And I think that tends to be my view, because I think Huxley predicted more accurately the kind of world we live in now, where there is a kind of tyranny of soft power, as it's sometimes called, rather than the jackboot on the face. And he was writing about a kind of mass consumer society where we were all treated like objects on a production line.
Sure. And Michael, C.S. Lewis, I mean, he also wrote science fiction books, didn't he, of sorts, but they were much more richly imagined works than Aldous Huxley's, wouldn't you say?
Yes, Lewis wrote a trilogy of interplanetary adventures, and the third of those books, That Hideous Strength, is also rather dystopian and prophetic. And I think George Orwell actually read it. I'm not sure about Huxley, but yes, Lewis was quite prophetic, both in that book and in his more philosophical work, The Abolition of Man. But of course, it's for the Narnia books that he's now best known.
I think I would agree with that. That I think a book like Out of the Silent Planet is much more, as you say, richly imagined. And indeed,
written by C.S. Lewis, a science
yes,
fiction
and
book.
So is Orwell's 1984. I think as a work of fiction, it's superior to Brave New World, which has its slapstick elements. But if we're talking purely about the ideas contained in it, then I think Brave New World is more interesting.
I mean, Aldous Huxley very much used the novel, didn't he, as a kind of means of getting his ideas and almost his ideologies over.
Yes, I mean, he famously said he didn't really think he was a novelist, he was an essayist, a man of ideas.
And C.S. Lewis, Michael, what would you say? I mean, he was a Christian, wasn't he? I mean, quite a committed believer.
Yes, indeed, and on his Poets' Corner memorial that was unveiled today, there's a quotation from him, from one of his theological works, which says, "I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." He was a very popular Christian apologist. He broadcast on the BBC during the Second World War, a broadcast which became the book Mere Christianity. So he had really that theological side, as well as his fictional side of Narnia, and indeed an academic side, because he was a professor at Cambridge University at the end of his career. He taught at Oxford for 30 years.
And The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, of course, very, very popular, being put on film, on stage. What do you think he would have made of the huge popularity that that particular work of his gained?
I think you would be astonished. His wife once said of Lewis's Narnia books, there are Jack's juvenile stories. We'll never get rich from those. And they've turned out to be some of the best-selling works of the second half of the 20th century. But I don't think Lewis predicted that.
And Nicholas, I have to ask you, of course, you can't discuss Aldous Huxley without the drugs, of course, because he experimented on drugs, although paradoxically he was very opposed to people using drugs, wasn't he? But nevertheless, so tell us a bit about that.
Well, I mean, I remember his second wife, Laura Huxley, when I went to interview her in Hollywood and at their home, I remember her telling me emphatically that he deplored the 60s drug culture. For him, it was a very precise experiment. It was part of a lifelong seeking to explore the limits of the mind, and he wanted to use it as a kind of shortcut to the kind of mystical experiences that the great visionaries like William Blake had. In my view, he failed. It was a disappointment because he didn't have that kind of mind, I don't think.
Didn't his wife pump him with LSD as he was dying?
She did, and we don't know whether he asked for it to be done or whether she did it or what the result was, because we have no record of it. But I think I mean, he actually knew the famous Timothy Leary, but they had a totally different approach, I think.
All right, and Michael Ward, to you very quickly, do you know what C.S. Lewis might have made of JFK?
No, he never talked about Kennedy. He wasn't very interested in politics. He once or twice refers to Huxley, but he wasn't very keen on modern literature either. He was more interested in medieval literature. That was his speciality as an academic.
All right, Michael Ward in Oxford and Nicholas Murray here in the studio. Gentlemen, thank you both very much indeed for discussing Aldous Huxley and C.S.